rats are part of an urban ecosystem. They have been, they are going to continue to be. There's no way to get rid of rats.
Right.
And the consequences of just distributing all of this poison for other wildlife, sometimes for pets, sometimes even for human children, is that worth it?
You are listening to Urban Wildlife Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Urban Wildlife Podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Tony Crosdale, with my man,
Billy Brown,
and our special guest, Christian Hunold. We've had you on before, Christian, and we're here to talk about one of your new papers, and I'm excited to hear about it. So why don't you give us a little background?
Yeah, thanks for having me back. Yeah, so a couple years ago, I started thinking about a sort of a trend I was seeing in urban wildlife management, particularly in the Western United States, around predators, coyotes, mountain lions, black bears to some extent, and cities in Oregon, California, Colorado were sort of, for the past 10 or 15 years, have been revising their sort of wildlife management plans, indicating a movement toward not less conflict, but willingness to sort of acknowledge coexistence with mammalian predators, of considerable size, and in some cases, potential actual sort of danger toward humans, right, and pets. And as part of that, a sort of a movement toward less lethal forms of management, right? Where maybe 20 or 30 years ago, if you were a coyote and you showed up in San Francisco, right, the police would sort of quietly dispose of you, throw the body in the bay or whatever, and there weren't any coyotes. And so around the turn of the century, they made sort of a switch, right? They stopped doing that. The city basically decided to stop killing animals for no reason other than their sort of presence in the city. And then, fairly quickly, the predictable thing happens. There are more and more coyotes. And today they're sort of everywhere and they're pretty visible and, pretty broadly sort of accepted. So anyway, this sort of got me thinking, all right, we should look at some of these wildlife management plans, municipal wildlife management plans, see to sort of what extent ideas of non-lethal management and mutual accommodation, coexistence, belonging, right, we're sort of reflected in these plans, right? Could you sort of say that these plans reflect perhaps, evidence of multi-species urban planning or anything like that? And so, I was talking to a student about this, and as part of those discussions, we're like, well, yeah, okay, that seems to be going on with, sort of the fuzzy, the sort of the majestic megafauna that sort of everybody claims to like, right? Like mountain lions in Los Angeles or whatever. But what about rats? What about sort of unwanted urban animals that are often despised? There are also some real non-trivial health risks, perhaps associated. If I'm running around in your kitchen or in hospitals or sort of other areas where you might come in close contact with rats in ways that aren't probably very good. Anyway, so we said, okay, let's look at both of these things. Let's look at the predators, the charismatic animals. They're, polarizing, but often politically a somewhat easy sell to people, once you sort of overcome some initial resistance, and the rats that are widely despised and unwanted. And so, the results of the paper are basically that the, commensal rodents like rats do not benefit very much from this broader movement toward less lethal forms of managing urban wildlife. Right? We continue to kill rats pretty much on a whim. Extermination campaigns kind of come and go. We use increasingly effective forms of poison, right? One of the problems with killing rats is that rats are, intelligent, they're social animals. Once they realize that a bait that they're taking is poisoned, right? Sort of word gets out and the other rats start to avoid the poison. And so in come what are called second generation anticoagulant rodenticides that have been around for a decade. I'm not a rodenticide scientist. I think they've been around for at least a decade though. Something we can probably check up on. What they do is they're slow acting. So it's like it's a blood thinner, right? Like just like first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, but they're slow acting. They can take up to many hours, maybe a day or two to actually kill the animal. So the rats remain alive and mobile, and as they begin to sort of weaken, right, they slow down and they become easy prey for predators, raptors, but foxes, coyotes, mountain lions, whatever. They become a very easy meal, and so. Yeah, a lot of people point out that the existence of these, and the use and the widespread use of these second generation anticoagulant rodenticides leads to a lot of secondary poisoning of other species, precisely the kinds of species that people like better. And so some cities in California, maybe in the mid-teens, 5 or 6 years ago, started imposing municipal bans on the use of these poisons. Where the municipal government wouldn't use them on city property, or maybe a somewhat wider sales ban. And then in 2014, California, the state of California, started to restrict the availability of these poisons to licensed exterminators and to farmers. So ordinary consumers could no longer just buy them in stores. And then in 2020, as we were writing the paper, California passed a statewide ban on these second-generation anticoagulant poisons. They can still be used in some contexts, in sort of medical settings or food storage settings, sort of warehouses. But the use is now highly restricted and will hopefully be phased out. Implementation always takes a while. So the question for us was then, what does this mean? Does this represent a meaningful step in the right direction toward, coexistence with rats, perhaps? And that did not turn out to be the case. Right? All other ways of killing rats remain legal and widely practiced. And again, what drove this in California is that, of course, in California, has particularly threatened populations of mountain lions in the sort of greater Los Angeles area that people get a lot of publicity, that people care about. About 70% of California's wildlife is documented to have had some exposure to rodenticides. And so the ban ultimately is sort of more of a response to preventing secondary poisonings and doesn't sort of signal that people have a change of heart about how they feel about rats.
Which I'm a little sad about.
Yeah, because ultimately, we do know that extermination campaigns of rats, particularly in sort of, outdoor settings like a corner park or wherever, are ultimately always temporary, right? You can kill a bunch of rats pretty quickly, and the colony sort of maybe goes away for a while, but unless you also drastically alter your sanitation practices, removing food attractants, and so on, they'll just come back, right? There's actually an interesting debate in this literature where people don't know and are trying to find out what is the result of these extermination campaigns, that we're sort of creating really sickly rats, right? Because they're constantly sort of being poisoned. Or are we conceivably even creating sort of super rats, right? The rats that can sort of survive the poison, right? There's always somebody whose body is strong enough to not die, or they're smart enough maybe to avoid the poison altogether. So to what extent is the widespread use of these and other poisons, reshaping, the rats that we have?
You get what you select for, right?
Yes, right.
Yeah, so this reminds me of a problem we had in my house here. Is with mice, not rats, but it's very similar. When we first got word of the pandemic, my wife's brother has a friend who is is in the Skull and Bones group, that weird club that lots of presidents and stuff are in, lots of military people.
Yeah.
and he got a text, that said like, hey, things are going to get crazy with this pandemic and really like prepare. Right. And we were like in Bermuda on like a baby moon and kind of like isolated and right while this is popping off. So I was like, you know what? I'm going to prepare for the worst and I'm going to like really stock up and get a lot of food and prepare just in case something happens. And I did. And I didn't invest in the containment for it as well as I should have. And we ended up getting a bit of a mouse infestation. And it was, it's gone now. And now I have everything in like if it's not in cans, it's in these like air tight buckets with like, oxygen absorbers and everything. But we had this hell of a time getting the mice out. And when we called the exterminator in, the first thing granted, I went and like, I did before I got exterminated, I tried to, make sure there's nothing they could get into. And then it was surprising what they would find. They would eat like my wife had like these like eye masks that had also like buckwheat inside them. They got into that it's crazy what they would get into. But when exterminators came, the first thing he did was went around, plugged up every hole with like this metal mesh, and just gave us some tips. And like he deployed some stuff, and I didn't want to read that aside, but he reiterated over and over again, the thing you got to do is make sure they can't get in your house, make sure you got nothing for them to eat. And it just seemed like it just kind of really drove home the fact that's how you see, as we call, it's these cultural controls. That's how you stop these things is with, preventing, sanitation and everybody wants to, find this solution, this lethal solution. I'm not opposed to lethal solutions by any means, but if they're not even effective, then what's the point? And I just think people are just stuck in this mindset that that's how you have to deal with it.
Well, you're making me think about coyotes also, which are, which I think per Christian's research, I mean, I'm referencing, Christian, let's wait a second. We didn't say, Christian, who are you? What do you do?
The environmental politics professor at Drexel University. So I'm a political scientist and political theorist by training. But for the past maybe, about 5 to 7 years, maybe, I've been writing a lot about urban wildlife and human animal studies. I guess critical animal studies is sort of the field.
Yeah.
So I look at human animal relationships from a sort of social science, political theory lens. I'm sort of interested in multi-species spaces. I write about multi-species cities. I'm interested in multi-species justice and planning. So the underlying question is sort of to what extent do our human practices, primarily political practices, but spatial practices too, include concern for and consideration of non-human life forms.
I just happen to have read 2 books by, I guess, an environmental historian named Dan Flores. And one is, I think, Coyote America, and the other one's the American Serengeti.
Yes.
And both of them cover sort of the extermination campaigns against predators in, I guess, our whole continent, but the United States, and then but largely the West.
Yep.
And we sort of stopped trying. Well, we means something weirder because we're of 2 minds about it in each of these cases, I guess, that the wolves have been on the endangered species list. Now they're not. And so people who have been wanting to exterminate them ever since we stopped trying to exterminate them a few decades ago, after decades and decades of very thoroughly exterminating them. And some people are now grab their guns, we get to exterminate them again. But then, mountain lions, we've had they were another predator that was subject of of up until, I don't know, 60, 70 years ago, a very thorough extermination campaign. And then coyotes, the campaign continues. I mean, it's it's an animal that in cities we've learned to love in some ways, but dude, if we're in Kansas in the countryside right now, you're doing coyote derbies where you're competing to see how many you can gun down in a night.
Right. There's sort of an interesting movement around banning these wildlife killing contests, right? Which mostly involve coyotes, foxes to some extent, but they're often around, or some of the rattlesnakes. those rattlesnakes in your Zoom background?
Yeah, we're doing a Zoom call, and Christian has
Right.
a nice skyline. This is background. I'm like, all right, I'll put a pile of gestating timber rattlesnakes in
There
the
you go.
background.
Yeah. So the vermin, right, are often sort of the
Varmints. Varmints.
subject of these wildlife killing contests. Which a couple of states have banned recently, so there's some progress around that. And mountain lions, we should say, there's no longer sort of extermination campaigns, but they are a game animal, and they are legally killed by hunters in the hundreds every year in the United States. So,
But wait a sec. Wait a sec. You didn't mention my background.
yeah.
Your background is your basement man cave?
Yeah, but my man cave is a shared space now, and I don't know if you
It's
can
a
see,
man
but
baby cave?
there is a Barbie dream house in the background now.
Yes. Yes.
If you want like a truckload of Barbie crap, let me know, and I'll rent a box truck and back it up to your driveway.
Yeah,
We've got-
yeah,
But
yeah. I mean, unless you want to save it for your, for Gilda, but yeah.
no. Gigi wants that out of the house the second Magnolia loses interest in Barbies.
Okay, yeah, we'll take it.
But
Yeah.
But what I was getting at is that you're talking about whether the sort of the grace that we've extended to predators in urban settings has been extended to rats, and no, not yet. But I was just thinking, man, with the predators, we haven't even gotten it outside of the cities. I mean, this is something that seems like a very, to me, like, I don't know, maybe this is taking us off the rat topic a little bit, but like, I mean, we're banning in California and some other places. I guess we're sharply regulating these anticoagulant poisons on the behalf or for the benefit of the predators.
Yes.
But then it strikes me we got a big rural urban divide on that. I don't see like anybody in the ranching West like extending much consideration even to the predators that the people of Portland or
no.
Francisco.
I mean, I think overwhelmingly, I think that's true. Although there are some, I suppose, renegade ranchers here and there, particularly around coyotes, who've found out through their own. I mean, it's basically guys who sort of started thinking, I'm just tired of shooting coyotes all the time, right?
Yeah.
It's the sort of the Aldo Leopold sort of epiphany, right? You're sort of, you kill the wolf, and at some point you're just kind of done with it. And you don't want to.
You're referring to Thinking Like a Mountain, an essay that's been published in San Antonio.
And it's often not necessarily anything beyond that initially, right? You just kind of, this is pointless because the coyotes always come back. And there's some really interesting experiences as well as research that show that once you start leaving, so coyotes are sort of, they have small families typically, right? So it's a breeding pair, and they have a litter every year when things go well, and some of the animals survive. Sometimes some of the younger animals stick around for a year or two, but they're relatively small family units, usually maybe up to half a dozen animals or something like that. And then the young kind of move on eventually. And what these farmers realized is that if they stop killing the coyotes figure out the rules. So as long as the farmer also maybe invests in a couple of sheepdogs and sort of makes it clear that, the lambs are sort of off limits. It doesn't mean that they don't still occasionally kill a lamb. But the sort of depredation rates of lambs goes way down, apparently, on ranches where the resident coyotes are not killed. There seems to be cultural knowledge that the coyotes pass down to their offspring. And of course, they're also not constantly replaced by new coyotes, who sort of don't know the rules. There's evidence with Australian dingoes that shows exactly the same thing. Sort of a similarly sized wild canid. They're sort of big enough to not really go after adult sheep very much, but lambs are certainly fair game. It's the same idea. So even there's some, again, pockets of a more progressive or less lethal approach in at least some rural areas where farmers are not necessarily, it's not necessarily that sort of animal lovers or coyote lovers necessarily, but they're to some extent tired of killing them all the time. And also it doesn't work, right? Not killing them is actually better.
That's the part that baffles me about these. It's sort of something that if you dive into hunting culture at all, you see this expression all the time, predator control.
Yeah, right.
That there's this idea that you're doing something you're doing something beneficial by constantly killing coyotes,
right,
even though they seem to keep coming back this is part of the subject of the book Coyote America by Flores. Is like, this is an animal that we think of ever more gruesome and elaborate ways to kill them. I mean, like
right.
I don't know, it's a relatively old innovation by this point, but it still amazes me. You got these spring-powered baits that shoot cyanide into their mouths when they bite the baits. And then like a succession of different poisons. You got killing them from helicopters. You got now you got, rate using electric, through, I guess, playing their calls to try to call them in and then shooting them.
Right.
Nothing seems to make a dent on their population levels.
No,
and it's like, at what point it's one of these things where it's like, dude, it's clearly not working. Why are you still doing it? I think because people like killing stuff. But,
that's what I come back to, right? There's clearly a sort of joy that people take in doing that. And the predator control sort of logic serves as a kind of cover, right? Or as a way to sort of make it make sense to yourself and others that doesn't involve having to admit that you basically just killing stuff.
So I guess
killing stuff does work sometimes too.
Sometimes, yeah. But with coyotes, it's particularly ineffective, it seems. Killing stuff was really effective if your goal was to get rid of wolves. Like they were a species you could definitely exterminate.
Yes.
Coyotes seem to be unexterminatable.
Yeah, I remember a really gruesome USDA study where they did an experiment, right? They had it's a large enclosure basically, and you had the numbers they came up with. You had to, I recall them very precisely, but you had to kill something like 75% of the population for 7 years in order to make a dent. And the only way to do that is with landscape level poisoning, aerial gunning, right? Neither of those two options work around cities or suburbs, which partly explains perhaps why coyotes find those habitats so attractive, right? Because they're not persecuted systematically in quite the same way. I mean, there's maybe a little bit of coyote hunting in cities here and there. There's obviously, traffic-related mortality and other sort of problems. But the kind of systematic persecution that would actually result in the decline of coyote populations is completely impractical in urban areas, right?
Yeah. But sorry, I realize I've taken us off on a long tangent away from rats. I guess my thinking was before the tangent was that 100 years ago, or even like 80 years ago, pretty close to unthinkable that we would embrace wolves. Today we have the urban coyote populations, which people are coming to terms with, which again would have been like totally nuts, like 30 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe. I wonder, do we think that rats and mice are somewhere in that continuum?
I don't know. I mean, the case for it, right? You would argue to make the case that that's possible. More and more research by ethologists about the social and emotional intelligence of rats, right? Who are clearly social to extent. I mean, they're not sort of just fungible rats kind of running around, right? They have communities. They have empathy. They'll try to rescue each other from drowning if they can, right? They share food. So one attempt, right, one line of argument is to sort of say, look, they're just like us, right? They have qualities that are recognizably the qualities of a social mammal, and that is often the basis for making a case that for empathy, for greater empathy toward a species, right? But I don't know. I mean, rodents have such a squig factor for a lot of people,
yeah,
right? That would require probably a level of sort of transformation, social transformation that's probably not really in the cards, right, for sort of a majority of people. On the other, I think what I could imagine is sort of what I usually sort of try to argue is that, look, rats are part of an urban ecosystem. They have been, they are going to continue to be. There's no way to get rid of rats.
Right.
And the consequences of just distributing all of this poison for other wildlife, sometimes for pets, sometimes even for human children, is that worth it, right? To sort of keep doing something that really isn't working. And that is also in sort of outdoor context, just completely unnecessary, right? I mean, I'd be the first person to say, yeah, you don't want rats in your hospital. You don't want rats living in the walls of your house, right? And leaving feces and urine. And totally, that's, you know.
I don't want typhus.
I don't want, yeah. I mean, there are transmittable diseases, and there are real, if you're in close proximity to rats in your house, you know, you don't want them in restaurant kitchens, etc. Right?
Yeah.
Again, no argument for me there. But these sort of pointless campaigns, you know, when people panic about seeing rats in Logan Circle in Philadelphia or other public parks, and then, you know, somebody complains to city agency, and then Parks and Rec or whoever distributes the bait boxes. You know.
Vector control.
What?
Vector control. It's part of the health department.
Yeah, the health department, I guess. That just seems so pointless. That, I think, is something we can change, probably.
And I hopefully, to turn some people on to what we're talking about in terms of how the poison gets distributed. So yeah, they vector control toss some poison down into holes. But also what we're talking about is, if you're, next time you're walking around a city, look for these little black shoebox sized boxes, like tucked in against the wall, like behind the landscaping. And that's what we're talking about. Tony, you had a story about finding these around the environmental center when you took over, right?
Yeah. And I probably had them removed. It's crazy how it's just kind of like standard, right? It's like, oh, let's have these things, you know, these poison boxes.
Yeah, just as a matter of course, you know. I mean, you walk, you know, anywhere in Philadelphia, along sort of apartment buildings or commercial real estate, museums on the Parkway.
Yeah, they're like black, and they're tend to be like, I don't know, like a pentagon, but one side is much longer. You know, like it's like a rectangle, but like kind of like.
Yeah, they come in different shapes. Like some are a little bit irregular in the way you're describing. Others sort of rectangular. They're about a foot.
And some
long.
Some look like they look like a plastic rock too.
Yes,
but so obvious.
Right. Yeah, they're sometimes sort of disguised to fit into the landscaping, right, to be less detectable.
It's maybe an obvious question,
Yeah.
but one that I don't know about. We were talking a minute ago. Now I'd have to reference this because Michelle Niermeyer, who's been on the podcast a bunch of times when she worked for Integrated Pest Management for the Penn State Extension, would talk about it. But we were talking about sort of the IPM approaches to rats, where you use multiple cultural, like changing our practices,
Sanitation, exclusion, right?
Exactly. And so I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. But in other places, like if we go to, I don't travel enough to know this, but if I go to a city if I go to Tokyo, or if I go to like Berlin or something, if I go to other cities, other places in the world where there are rats everywhere, you know, like
right.
how do other cities handle rats?
So, I mean, I guess, well, there's no specific answer to that because cities are so different and it depends on where they are.
Sure, but yeah.
But certainly in a place like Japan or Northern Europe, you would see more careful handling of household and commercial waste. So, you know, one of the things that is not helping in a city like Philadelphia is the sort of, you know, somewhat relaxed approach to trash disposal, right? There are behind restaurants, you'll see containers that are, I mean, they have a lid on them, but there's often a huge gap, right? They don't really fully close. So certainly rats can get into those very easily. Or in tourist areas, you'll have public trash cans, but it's not, you know, maybe they're empty once a day, maybe a couple times a week. But, you know, if you wanted to cut down on rat populations, the first thing I would do is to just make sure that the trash is securely stored. But that would require changing regulations about what kinds of design of dumpster, trash cans is mandatory, who pays for all of that, and you'd have to pay for more frequent trash pickup, right, in public places. All of which is expensive, time consuming. It's just easier to put out a bunch of bait boxes and wait for some rats to die, and then they become less visible, and then the tourists stop complaining, right, about the residents. I mean, ultimately, the part of the argument that we're making in the paper, it's not the real threat of contracting a disease that people are worried about or complain about. It's the visibility of the rats,
right?
And so, if that's the problem,
and they're often visible in the places where they're the least problem, like they're least threatening. I mean,
they're visible in a public park, right, or in a public space where they're running maybe to a trash can, right, that's not been emptied for a while, and you can sort of see them there. That's not where you would get typhus or whatever, right? That's not. Yeah. There's no way that rat could communicate a disease to you.
You're not going to get the fleas off that rat while it's running.
That's right. In that context, that seems. If you're not sleeping next to the trash can, right? The unhoused people. I wonder sometimes, right? People who sleep on places like Logan Circle and have rats crawling all over them all the time. I wonder to what extent, right? Their risk is obviously greater than mine. Who just walk by and maybe see the rat and not have it crawl all over me. But anyway, so the political problem for cities, for tourist bureaus or elected officials is the rat's visibility, not the rat's presence per se. And so improved sanitation is usually makes the biggest difference in the visibility of rats. Because they're above ground when they look for food waste, and that is not particularly well controlled in Philadelphia.
So we've got about 5 minutes to go. I wanted to just ask Tony on the bird side of things. This discussion reminds me about crows. I was trying to think of what's a bird whose persecution is quite tolerated, and nothing to me sounds that way besides crows. I mean, in cities we don't shoot them quite so much, and we get annoyed by them roosting in large numbers, but in rural settings, certainly you can there's in PA there's no closed season on crows and no limit.
I mean, I don't know what I could add more than that's probably the only thing I can think about. Mourning doves are the most killed animal, I think, a terrestrial animal in the country, and I don't know if they're considered agricultural pests, but I know doves and like ear doves in Argentina, they kill them in the thousands and thousands and thousands, literally there's you go down there and just people will hand you loaded shotguns and you just shoot and shoot and shoot all day because they're considered a huge agricultural pest. So I don't know, I know in other parts of the world just certainly birds are considered pests, but not so much here. The one thing though, a lot of times we come back to cats, but it's interesting how cats are tolerated by a lot of people, and they actively feed them, and then the feeding of them, they're talked about as being a control of their defense is that they control rodents, but yet their food attracts rodents. Is that anything that's come across when thinking about rats to you, Christian?
Yeah, I'm not sort of an expert on the cat side, except it seems like there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that cats actually kill a lot of rats. If they do, obviously they do kill rodents, but they tend to prey on mice, on voles. They might catch maybe a juvenile rat every now and then, but rats don't really seem to be on the menu of cats a great deal.
Rats are bruisers. This is the thing that I think. Yeah. I have been bitten by rats a couple of times. It really hurts, and they're fast and they're smart.
Yes.
And and classically, if you want an animal that kills lots of rats, you get a terrier. In any case, to Tony's point, or a red-tail hawk
that gets killed by the rodenticide.
But
we haven't mentioned it, but apparently it's the number one reason raptors are brought into rehab centers is rodenticide poisoning. Yeah,
anecdotally, that seems to be the case in Philly, where the red-tailed hawks that inhabit the Parkway and the sort of surrounding neighborhoods routinely are made sick and die by rat poison.
Yeah.
They prey on rats. They eat each hawk probably eats 2 to 3 rats a day. And when they do that in areas where there are a lot of bait boxes, and the poison sort of builds up pretty quickly, they develop anemia. They get weaker, obviously, when you're anemic, and they start flying into things and have fractures and eventually succumb to an injury that's either cumulatively, there's a lot of sort of internal bleeding injuries, or a major injury that sort of kills them outright.
Christian, if people want to read the paper, where is it?
It is in a journal called Animals, and it is open access. And it was published in, give you the full reference, in the journal Animals, volume 10 in October 2020. It's called Human-Wildlife Coexistence in Urban Wildlife Management, Insights from Non-Lethal Predator Management and Rodenticide Bans.
Synanthropic organism.
Awesome. So with that, if you want to get in touch with us, you can email us at urbanwildlifecast@gmail.com or hit us up on Twitter at urbwildlifecast. So Christian, thanks for coming on.
Yes,
Thanks so much, buddy.
me, man. Yes.
Cheers.
All right.
And we'll revisit the whole bike birding and photography thing soon, Christian.
Yeah, that'll be fun. The weather this winter has to stop at some point, right?
Thanks, guys.
All right. Much love, buddies. Cheers.
Bye.